So with those couple of things said, one more precursor, and that is kind of where we're going in these next 4 weeks. We can't cover everything about marriage in 4 weeks. I don't know about you guys, but when we got married, we went to conference after conference on marriage. It was kind of to the point where it was like, you go to those conferences and you go to the Bible studies and you go to the Sunday school classes and you do it. And after a while, it's like, we just need to apply a few things that we do know before we learn any more. But the reality is there are some foundational principles of our understanding of the institution of marriage that if we don't get those down, we won't be able to grow in other areas that may seem at times to be more pressing or more felt need oriented. And I look at it kind of this way. I was standing out in my front yard this last week and I looked at my house. And as I'm looking there, I'm looking at a dead plant over here. I'm looking at some scraggly bushes over there. I'm looking at a couple of things that just don't fit. It was probably one of those things that when the builder bought it, he had a deal on it and he puts it in there, but it really has no business in the front of a house. And so I'm kind of looking at this, and my immediate response is I'm going to get my axe and my shovel, and we're going to just tear all this out. But then I got to thinking, what would my wife do when she comes home and we have nothing in front of our house? And so I'm thinking, okay, I need to think, what am I going to put in place of that I tear out? And then I'm thinking, I have no idea that even the name of any of the shrubs that are there, much less what I would replace them with. So before I do that and start tearing things out, I need to get a landscape designer, somebody that understands shrubbery, understands balance, understands how to do all this. I need them to come out and give me an idea, give me a plan to go by. If you would, give me a design that I can then implement. And the same thing is true of our marriage. We can start ripping things out that we don't think we like, but if we don't have a master design, then there's going to be nothing to replace it. And so what we're going to do these next 4 weeks, hopefully, is kind of look at a master design of what God has designed marriage to be. And then a lot of the applications will flow out of that. Now we're going to do this through what I would call a topical expositional series. And that means we're going to do the topic of marriage, but we're going to go to individual passages and we're going to exposit, teach those passages as they relate to the issue of marriage. And the very first one that we're going to look at this week is interesting because it's in the Old Testament. It is a prophetic writing, and it is a text in which God is actually rebuking the nation of Israel. And in this text, he is going to address the nation of Israel in the area of the marriage covenant in 2 ways. And one of them is that he addresses them for the fact that they have gone outside of the nation of Israel, outside of the Jewish faith, and they have married foreign, in this case, women. Now, to understand the context of why that would have been important is a number of things, but one is that it was very important that they not be drawn away into adultery of the neighboring nations. And so what would oftentimes happen as they would interact with the neighboring nations, they would marry individuals who did not share their faith and in fact had idolatrous worship practices, and they would marry them, and then they would be pulled away into that idolatry. So this isn't talking about individuals from neighboring nations that might actually come as God-fearers and submit to becoming a Jew and accepting the faith of Abraham. If they did that, then obviously they would be free to marry. But it's those that were worshiping pagan gods, and that was considered in that case a mixed marriage. And then he takes up the second issue, and that's what we're going to address today. And in this text, I want us to come away with a definition of marriage. Now, if I just ask you what a definition of marriage is, I'm not sure exactly what you would say. There's probably some of you that would give a nice textbook definition, especially after you Google it. There'd be others that would kind of probably have some vague notions of what it is. Maybe you'd even repeat some of your marriage vows. But what I want us to do in this text is look at this not just from the negative rebuke that God is placing on Israel, but turn around and say, okay, what is the positive picture of marriage that God has in his mind that they have violated? Does that make sense? So we'll come from the positive aspect of the text. We're going to be looking at Malachi chapter 2. Malachi chapter 2, if you haven't already seen that in your notes. Malachi chapter 2. Malachi is the last book in what we call our Old Testament. But Malachi chapter 2, we're going to be picking up in verse 13, and I want to read down through verse 16, but we're really going to focus our attention on verse 14. But to get it in context, let's read a little broader. So in verse 13, he says, "In this second thing you do." So in the book of Malachi, God is approaching them and saying, here's a number of things that I have a problem with you about. Now, if you know anything about God's relationship with the nation of Israel, it was a covenant relationship by which God promised his relationship to them and what I understand to be eternally as you look at broader texts. But he also gave some understandings that if they disobeyed him, if they personally went against his covenant or his commands, then they would receive cursings. If they obeyed what he had asked, they would receive blessings. Well, at this point, they are standing at this point in history, and they are seeing a lot of the cursings, and they're asking, why is that? And God is now going to tell them, well, here's the reasons why. And so this is one of the reasons why. And this second thing you do, you cover the Lord's altar with tears, with weeping and groaning, because he no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand. Now, before we go further, we need to get this. He's talking to the nation of Israel. He's talking to his people. He's not talking to the culture. He's not talking to the Egyptians or the Assyrians or anyone else. He is talking here to those people that would consider themselves children of Abraham, God's people. And that's important for us to remember, because when we go through this series, we're not going to think about or focus on what anybody else, the Rainbow Coalition or anybody else says about marriage. We are coming as God's people to say, what does God say about marriage? And so that's important for us to get the context of who he's talking to, because it's also, these are harsh words that he's given to his people. And sometimes we may need to not worry so much about what the outside world is doing with something like marriage, but what are we doing as God's people with something like marriage? And then he goes on in verse 14, but you say, why does he not? In other words, here we are, we're doing all of the religious practices. We're doing these sacrifices. We're doing all these things so that God will bless us, yet he is not blessing us. What is going on? Now, in case we think sometimes that their world is so different than ours, we can hear this of saying, sometimes we come to church, we do all the things that we think we're supposed to do religiously, and then we ask, why is God not honoring or blessing us? And yet there is a glaring area of sin and disobedience in our lives that we will not deal with. And in this case, it's marriages. So, God, I come to church, I read my Bible, I even give my money. And he says, but we got a problem with your marriage. So that's sobering for us to realize that we need to understand it is not the rituals that God's interested in. It's the heart, it's the relationships. So he goes on, and he says, because the Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. Now we're going to read the rest of this in a moment. I will go ahead and warn you of one thing. Verse 15, I was reading in all of the commentaries because I tried to get through this in the Hebrew and was totally confused, and I was so thankful. I picked up one of the Hebrew commentators, and he said it's almost unintelligible. And I'm like, okay, I knew my Hebrew was bad, but I'm thankful it's not that bad. It's a difficult verse, and we'll try to get through that as we get to it. But from this verse, I want us to construct the primary part of our definition of marriage. The primary part of our definition of marriage. And the first thing I want us to say in that definition is that marriage is a covenant. Marriage is a covenant. He says it here very clearly. He says that you have been faithless, though she, your wife, is the companion and the wife of your youth, or the wife by covenant. Now, one little thing I'll just kind of get out of the way so we don't get confused. In that day, a woman would have had very little right or opportunity to divorce her husband. That was primarily a male privilege, and that's a terrible word to use, but that's actually something that would have been instituted by the male. So in this context, we're reading from that history. When we bring it to the modern day, let's just use the word spouse. Maybe you've forsaken the spouse of your youth. And here he makes it clear that this relationship that you have together was by covenant. Now, a covenant can be defined in a number of different ways. Let me give you a very simple definition. A covenant is the binding or establishment of a bond between two people. It's the binding or the establishment of a bond between two people. Throughout history, even during this time, that would have been symbolized even in marriage, oftentimes in such ways that people would cut their palms and then put their hands together and bind a rope around it to say they'd become one flesh, one blood in a sense, but there was this aspect of them being bound together. Now, when we think about that aspect of a covenant and we bring that into marriage, sometimes we can get confused on what we in modern day terminology might consider a contract. Well, one pastor, Chris Hodges, does something that I think can be somewhat helpful, and that is that he talks about the difference between maybe what this biblical idea of a marriage covenant is and what a contract is. And let me give you 3 points that he makes, 3 differences he makes between this idea of a covenant and that of a contract. And lawyers, don't write me emails about the specificity of this. This is kind of at a high level, but I think it is helpful for us to think through. And the first thing is this: a covenant is based upon mutual commitment, where a contract is based upon mutual distrust. So a covenant is upon mutual commitment. A contract is upon mutual distrust. I mean, the reality is every time we go into some type of a real estate deal, buy a car, do anything like that, we have to read these 15-page contracts. My sister's a lawyer. I oftentimes accuse the entire world of being now devoted to funding lawyers, because it seems like everything we do has to be in a contract. Her wise response is, that's because the whole world has fallen and depraved. She's right. But that idea of contract is that there's some distrust. I don't believe you will actually fulfill your part, and so I want a contract there, so in case you don't fulfill your part, I will be protected. And see, this idea of covenant says there is this idea that we are going in this together. We are locking arms, and it's like 2 soldiers going into battle. We're going in together, and we're going to fight through this thing, and we're not leaving each other. And that's the way this covenant is pictured. It's a mutual commitment out of love and respect and commitment to the Lord, and not one that's built out of distrust. And that's interesting as we talk about the idea of things like prenuptial agreements and those things that are now written into many marriage license or contracts. The second distinction he makes is a covenant assumes responsibility and a contract limits responsibility. So when you go into a covenant, you assume that you and the other person are going to fulfill certain responsibilities of that covenant, and you are not looking for escape clauses out of responsibility. And yet many contracts we sign are set in place so that we won't be held responsible if something goes wrong. And yet, here with a mutual commitment and a covenant, you both own full responsibility for the health and the progress of that marriage commitment or that marriage covenant. The third distinction he made is that covenant has the interest of the other in mind, where a contract has personal interest in mind. So when I link into a covenant, I'm saying this covenant is not only for my benefit, but it is for the other person's benefit. And I come into the relationship knowing that. And I'll tell you, that can be kind of a tough one, because oftentimes when we're single, what we're thinking about is, I have a hole, or I'm lonely, or I need something to meet this need in me. And so oftentimes we even go into a dating relationship asking the question, how are they going to meet the need that I feel? Rather than going in and saying, what do I bring to meet the need of that other person? And so we sometimes even set up in a dating relationship or a thought relationship that it's a very selfish perspective by which we even pursue marriage or a dating relationship. And here it says that a contract has personal interests in mind. Again, what am I going to get out of it? How is this going to benefit me? rather than a mentality of a covenant that says it is the other person that will ultimately benefit in this as well. So the first thing we see is that marriage is a covenant. Now you're going to see something else in this text, and please take note of this. This is extremely important. Because earlier in the text, do you remember what he said? He goes, at the beginning of verse 14, he says, because the Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth. Who's the witness of this covenant? Have you ever signed a contract or maybe called a covenant and you have to have a witness? When we do marriage license, it's got to be a witness. That's because that witness is verifying that you made this promise. You made this covenant. And I would even go so far as that witness, part of their role is to hold you to that covenant. So when we do a marriage, and when I conduct a marriage, I will oftentimes talk about the fact that those that are gathered here are witnesses to this marriage, as is the Lord. And that this covenant is being made before Him. So God has seen this covenant. He is a witness of it. That has the language of covenant. And so we need to grasp that simple terminology, that your marriage is more than a license. Your marriage is ultimately not a covenant with the state. Your marriage is ultimately a covenant with your partner before God Almighty, that you will fulfill His directives for what a marriage is. That is so important for us. We're not going to win the court battles on what marriage is supposed to be. And I don't care. Would I like America to reflect biblical priorities in marriage? Absolutely. But no matter what the culture says marriage is, we've got to come back and say, what does God say marriage is? Because the covenant that we make as believers or followers of Him are ultimately before Him as the designer of marriage, but also the witness of marriage. And so here, this idea of covenant is very important. But let me get to the second part of this definition. And that is that marriage is a covenant of companionship. A covenant of companionship. And that's what he says here, kind of reverts his wording a little bit. But he said that I have this against you, that you have been faithless to the wife of your youth, though she is your companion. And actually it's kind of an appositive there. She is your companion, defined by the fact that she is yours by covenant. So the nature of this covenant is a covenant of companionship. Now companionship, interesting enough, this word, or this Hebrew word, is the only time in the Old Testament scriptures, in the Hebrew Bible, that this word is used. And I actually think the writers of our translations did a great job of using the term companion or companionship. The similar term would be partner, but partner falls a little bit short because you can sometimes read partner like a business contract instead of a relational contract. And so companion maybe brings a little bit more of that in, but both those concepts of partnership and companionship are together. And if you think about just broadly what that means, when you think about having a companion, what do you think about? I think about somebody that just goes through life with me. The ups and the downs. Usually because that companion is there, it makes it a little more bearable. And this is a terrible analogy, but I'm going to use it anyway. It's like when someone is oftentimes, maybe their spouse has passed away, we'll oftentimes hear it's great to give them a companion, like a companion dog, to be there, to be with them. That's a terrible thing to say because it's like the husband's really the dog, but that's not at all what I mean. But what we are saying is there's something about having someone there with you that is comforting as you go through life, that is a support as you go through life. And this idea of covenant of companionship is to be that. And here's what you need to grasp. And it's one of the most comforting things, but also something that we can lose sight of. And that is that you need your spouse on your worst day. You need your spouse when you are at your worst. Right? When you are unloving, when you are biting, when you are frustrated in life and you begin to let that out and speak, who else is going to accept you even while you have that behavior? Well, it's not excusing the behavior, but that person loves you despite it, is going to stick by you, and they will ultimately help you through it if you have a covenant of companionship. Now, I want to give you 5 very practical suggestions that can help deepen your companionship. Now, I started to put verses out with each one of these, but I'm not going to proof text every one. I think you'll find that I'll mention a few texts as we go through this, but I think you'll find these to be very biblically oriented. We just simply don't have time to go to every one. But let me give them to you and see if they might not spur you on to a little deeper companionship with your spouse. Here's the first thing. Spend time together. Brilliant, aren't I? If you're going to have a companion, you have to spend time with them. Now that sounds so utterly obvious, but do you know how many married couples, the individuals in the marriage, are lonely? And I tell singles this all the time. Some of the loneliest people I know are married because they have forgotten what it means to spend time together. How busy is your life? I mean, if you're married, it becomes a little more busy. Add to that one child, gets a little more busy. Add to that a second child. At that point, you go into a zone defense. Add a third, and you're outnumbered. And then they start getting involved in soccer, baseball, basketball, fishing, whatever else that are their interests. And before long, you're going 100 different directions. You get up in the morning, the husband's going one way, the wife's going another way, the kids are going another way. You're trying to get all the kids where they need to be. Lunch is made, kids going hopefully with clothes on and hair's done. You're trying to get them where they need to be. You come home, you got sports activities, you got things at the school, you got dinners. By the time the day is over, usually the wife is trying to go somewhere where she can decompress. The husband's trying to go somewhere where he can decompress. Or they simply go to bed and they fall asleep. And the question becomes, are we cutting out time in our life to simply spend time together? In Genesis, it says that the husband, and really I would say it applies to both, they are to leave and cleave. And that has an idea that they cleave together, that there's a relationship, that they spend time together. And I know time is a constraint for many of us. But I want to tell you that you need to make sure you're spending that time together. The last thing you want to do is reach the empty nest years and realize I don't know my spouse. And let me kind of dispel one thing, and that is that this time doesn't always have to be something that is out there that you particularly both enjoy doing. Like, you may be a couple that both enjoys bike riding and you go bike riding together. But it may be that, one of you is athletic and one's not, and you start finding these common interests, and there's not that many of them, but you'll find one. You'll find some that's the things you did when you were dating together. So, men, take your wife out on a date. Every day, make sure that there's time, and it may be that you have to wake up earlier in the morning, or it may be time that when you come home, you lock the kids in their rooms so you have a few minutes together, or maybe you can put the kids down and have some time after that, but you need to make sure every day that you have some amount of time together for a conversation of adult nature. And side note, this isn't in my notes, so I'll come over here. Men, if you work all day and your wife stays home with the kids, so this doesn't apply to everybody, but if that's your situation, or vice versa, and your wife is with toddlers all day, do you know how much she wants to have an adult conversation? For you to come home and simply engage her in adult conversation, but you've won her heart because all she's heard all day is, why, what, why. I mean, that's her world. So this idea of making sure that time is spent together, something Allie and I have done, and we plan on doing it here this next month, is to also just spend some time where you get away for a weekend together. And there's a lot of things you can do on that weekend. I went to a study years ago where it gave us this template that we could go through with our wife when we went away together to talk about calendar planning and finances. And so I went with my little sheet. And, we go to dinner, and I'm trying to figure out, how do I work this in to the weekend. And you know what? My wife could have cared less about that little sheep. Because we were busy. We were going all the time. She just wanted me. So if you're both goal-oriented people, maybe you're both engineers, get your sheet out, follow a script. If not, just be there with each other. Talk about things that matter. And if you have kids, talk about your kids, but don't just talk about your kids. Talk about other things as well, which brings us to the second practical helper for developing companionship, and that is work on communication. So when you spend time together, work on communication. Work on your ability to talk well together. I love that one of the writers of the New Testament tells the husband, live with your wife in an understanding manner. Talk about difficult commands. But if you don't take time to talk and to communicate and you're just trying to guess what your wife loves, what she's feeling, what's hurting her, what she's taking joy over, you'll never get it. Most of us won't. Some of you may be very astute. Most of us are a little more dull than that. And we need to have conversation. We need to communicate well. And let me give you two hints. I'm going to give the men a huge help, and I'm going to give the women a huge help. And I'm going to tell this by, if you could just memorize a couple of statements in your communication, it will change and transform your marriage. Is that a promise or what? Okay, here's the first one. Men, when you come home and your wife starts telling her about your day, and there's a pause, say these words. And then what happened? It will transform your marriage. You know that because what happens in your world? When you tell her something, her next comment is, well, what did she say? What did he say then? What happened next? That's the way oftentimes, and I'm generalizing a little bit, that's the way oftentimes these conversations work. Now, women, let me give you one. So when your husband comes home and he talks about the project that he finished at work or the video game level that he accomplished or the sermon that he preached, memorize these 4 words. Honey, you are awesome. It's really all he needs right there. Now notice, I didn't say what you did was awesome. I mean, you might could care less if they did the video game. You hope they weren't on the video game. My sermon might have been terrible, but to see her look in my eyes and say, you're just awesome. I mean, I'm interpreting that as I did awesome. She might not admit that. She supports me though. You know, I say those somewhat frivolously, but here's what you do need to know. Don't just hear your spouse, but listen to your spouse. When they're sharing with you about their day, they're sharing with you things that are important to them. And you might think they're frivolous. You may not really care what the next person did or said. But if you care for them, then you will begin to care. Because you want to know what's on their heart. So it's a deeper issue than just memorizing those words. But it's knowing what your spouse needs you to hear. And I would also suggest what your spouse needs you to give them in return. And I asked Allie if I could share this because I'm really sometimes not so good at that. And she will gently say, what do I want you to say right now? Which is like, oh gosh, I don't know. And sometimes I'll say, I'm not sure, tell me. But what she's saying is, have you heard me? Have you heard my heart? And sometimes it's like, okay, well, I guess she wants me to solve the problem. She doesn't want me to solve the problem. Sometimes she wants me to say, it's going to be okay. It's going to be all right. You know? It's amazing how just simple acts of listening to hear what they need is so important in developing that companionship. The third thing, check that time. The third thing, share your goals and dreams. If you want to develop that covenant of companionship at a different, deeper level, share your goals and your dreams. Now, I mean that in 2 ways. You know, dreams are fragile things. The things you want out of life, the things you dream about, they're fragile. And here's what I've found with many people when they're young and they're, teens and maybe into their 20s, we have a lot of dreams. What is the world going to be like? What are we going to accomplish? And we develop those and we play with them. And then I find as people get older, sometimes those dreams begin to drift and they don't hold them anymore. Maybe things haven't turned out exactly right, but I want to suggest to you people normally never lose those dreams. They may still have them at 40, 50, even 60 years old. And do you know what that dream is of your spouse? Do you have a relationship, a companionship that you might share with them, a dream that you would never share with anybody else? Maybe one day you'd like to write a book. You wouldn't tell anybody that. Maybe one day you would love to play an instrument. I'm too old, I'm not going to tell anybody that. Well, what if you began to share some of those things with your spouse so that they could support you and encourage you and help you in that? So it could be those individual dreams. It could be a career dream that you have that you can share with your spouse like you can share it with no one else. But there's also the dreams and the goals that you have for your family. You sit down and share what you want your relationship to be like, what you want your kids to learn, how do you want them to grow. Sometimes you talk about these things, but you've got to keep those conversations fresh. What are the goals that we have for our family? What are the goals that we have for each other? And sometimes, as you're raising your kids, sometimes that goal is simply, what's the day when they move out on their own? And you forget, your life doesn't end then, particularly your marriage. There are two time periods when most marriages move towards divorce. The first one is somewhere in that 5 to 7 year time period, maybe up to 10 years. A lot of people say that's the first crisis point in a marriage. Matter of fact, some of you may remember the old movie, The 7-Year Itch. I think it was kind of developed from that. Sometimes that's because kids are now in the picture and the stress of all that happens. Maybe sometimes the romance is worn off and you're not sure what to do with that. But the other time is when the kids move out and they're empty nesters. And there's two reasons that becomes a time of great crisis. One is it was only the kids that was holding the marriage together. We're just going to stick this out for the sake of the kids. I think Nathan's going to talk about parenting on our final session in this. But I want to tell you that it doesn't make it easier on the kids when you divorce at 30 or when they're 30 than when they're 12. It's a different set of situations. But that's not even the issue. See, oftentimes we think that's just holding us together. The other thing is that we've become so identified with our individual roles or with our kids, we have not developed our relationship together. Because see, I see the other side of that, and I could point out people in this church, and I'm not going to do it, but their marriage continued to go deeper and richer after their kids moved out. In fact, one of my friends recently said, I forgot how good it was. I won't tell you what else he said about that stage of life. But when his kids moved out, it was just like, the time that we had to invest into each other was expounded. But because they had built into their relationship, there wasn't a gulf there. So share your goals and your dreams, both now and for your future, for your family. Fourth is celebrate differences. If you want to have a covenant of companionship, celebrate your differences. One writer has said, drop the compatibility myth. And what they mean by that is that you don't have to be like the other person to be married with them. And in fact, I would say that some of the people that I know that have the happiest marriages are probably quite different in a lot of ways. Now, in one sense, we can look at that. When God created man in the garden, it says something that is very insightful. It says, when God created man, He created him male and female. Okay, just trying to see if you're awake. Male and female are in God's design. And men and women are different in order to fulfill the purposes that God has for marriage. So there's a male-female difference, and we need to celebrate that. But there are also differences in things we enjoy doing, our likes, our strengths, our weaknesses. Some of us are big picture people. And we think about the big things, the big pictures, where we want to go in life all the time, and we forget to pay the bills. Maybe that other person in your marriage relationship is a detailed person. And so instead of seeing that as a conflict, how does it look to have those two pieces working together? Allie and I have a lot of similarities. We have a lot of differences. One of them is doing what I'm doing right now. I enjoy teaching. I enjoy being up front, talking. She's not pastor number 2. She's not going to want to stand up front and speak from up front. She is great one-on-one with people, far superior than I am. We were talking the other day that everywhere she goes, she meets somebody. She'll go to one of the kids' games. She becomes best friend with the person next to her. That's part of her personality. That's part of where we are different but complementary. And we need to celebrate those things. Be very careful that you don't degrade your spouse for their differences, but you celebrate those differences. You don't want to marry you. You may not believe that, but you don't want to marry you. Marry somebody that is complementary to you. Celebrate differences. Finally, if you want to have a marriage covenant of companionship, feed the romance. Feed the romance. Some people just start shaking their head on that one. There's a passage in 1 Corinthians that says, do not deprive one another. It's talking about the sexual relationship between husband and wife. And a lot of people, men particularly, will want to run to that passage. But let's not take that in isolation, because I think the importance of romance is the backdrop by which that type of companionship and intimacy is actually built on. I have a wood pellet grill at home. Greatest thing I've ever gotten. Got it for my 50th birthday. Outside of my wife and children. And salvation. Greatest gift I've ever had. It has this great thing on there. It's a hopper on the side, and you light the fire in there, and then it automatically just feeds the pellets to keep it at just the right temperature so that I can cook my meat to absolute perfection. It's a terrible analogy, but your marriage is kind of like that. Starts out hot. Light that fire, it's cooking, but if you don't feed it, it's going to go out. So to think about ways to do that, and I'll tell you, some of you are better at that than others. And for those of you that struggle in how to feed the romance, let me just give you a couple of things that might help. And one is, take a step back and ask this question, what would I have done or did I do when we were dating to win that person's attention? Because the thing that we oftentimes do is we do that to win their attention, then once we got their attention, it's on to something else. And we forget what it means to romance our spouse. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of details because it would get rather embarrassing in the moment. We'll do that in one of our classes that we can go into some of that detail. But I just want to encourage you to think about what that looks like in your marriage. If you want to have a companionship that lasts, work on the romance, work on celebrating differences, work on your goals and dreams, work on communication, and all of this takes shape in the context of spending time together. Now, there's one other aspect of our definition of marriage, and let me put it on the screen for you. We're going to cover it as we move through the rest of our series, but it is this. Marriage is a covenant of companionship with a purpose. Marriage is a covenant of companionship with a purpose. The end goal is not just the companionship. The end goal is not just to walk down the aisle, get the ring on the finger, I've done it. God has purposes for your marriage that extends beyond your personal satisfaction, moves beyond just what we might want to say is your personal happiness, even though I think God wants that as well through your marriage. So at least one aspect of that purpose is that, to provide to God children who follow Him. Now we're going to talk more and flesh some more of that out in the coming weeks. He goes on, and just finishing out these verses, says, so guard yourself in your spirit, let none of you be faithless to the wife, of your youth. I think that's a really helpful translation of a difficult passage, but he's just reemphasizing again this fact that you need to be faithful to the spouse of your youth that you made that covenant commitment with. Then verse 16, for the man who does not love his wife but divorces her, says the Lord, the God of Israel, covers his garment with violence, says the Lord of hosts. So guard yourselves in your spirit and do not be faithless. Don't necessarily focus on where you've been in your marriage. Now, you need to celebrate that which is good. You need to remember your marriage covenant. In fact, don't fall into that thing that when your spouse asks you, do you love me? And you say, well, 25 years ago, I said it up front. I'll let you know when I change my mind. Hopefully, that's being shown in a day-to-day experience. But here's what I know. There's some of you in here right now that you've been divorced. And you may not be able to undo what was in the past. And that's why we've titled this series, This Point Forward. You need to start where you're at and commit to doing it God's way from here on out. If that means that you have remarried, do it God's way from here on out. If you've been divorced and neither one of you are remarried and there's an opportunity for re-engagement, I would pursue that to God's glory. Maybe you're in a position where your marriage is doing pretty good. But the question is, could we be even deeper in our companionship from this point forward? And that's what I want us to focus on. Don't be drugged back by your past. Don't let Satan be sitting there saying, hey, this isn't for you because you've screwed up so much in the past. Look at your marriage. It's never going to recover. God is a God of redemption. And if you do it His way, I can guarantee you, He will honor that. He will redeem it. And from this point forward, you will understand in a new way what a covenant of companionship is like, and one that flourishes to the glory of God.